So once again, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome back. I hope the first session, the breakfast tea pairing session, was as intriguing for you as it was for me, and I thank Edwin for an insightful presentation. Please refer the details on page 65 of your workbook. Now, all those tea pairings were made using the new Vivid tea collection, which is an artisanal line, which is entirely natural flavors. And so many of you mentioned that the Earl Grey tasted differently. Earl Grey, which is derived from bergamot, it has 100 different tonalities, and hence we chose a softer, more floral tonality, and so the profile is slightly different. And for this reason, you will also see differences in the teas in Tea Makers Private Reserve, in Vivid, in the Silver Jubilee, and so on. But those variations are natural and very important in terms of the differentiation. Now, today we have several very important extensions to what you have already covered. We have Edwin explaining the science behind the terroir. Importantly, it is also supported by an examination. So what I encourage you to do is please pay attention, because it is absolutely important. To understand that teas are different is important, but then to understand why they are different is equally so. Edwin has done a lot of original research, and he will present the principles, which I hope will help clarify and help you to also explain to your guests in the event the question comes up. But remember, when you explain a point about tea, when you give your guest a grain or two of information that is original, you create wow. And when you create wow, you're elevating tea from the cup to the experience. You're presenting to them why Ranwatta is lighter, brighter than Yatawatta, why Yatawatta is chocolatey, and then linking to that, you're presenting all the complex of linkage with food, with mixology, etc. The heart, the seed, the essence of all that is in what Edwin will present to you. It is in the terroir, the natural influence of tea. Everybody, every product category is looking for purity, is looking for natural today. And in tea, you have a herb that is more natural than anything. It is so natural that texture, flavor, character, the whole personality of the tea is dictated definitely by nature. And so we need to show that. We need to present it. You will have the science behind that. Shortly thereafter, we are very privileged to welcome Dr. Tissa Amarkon, who is an eminent scientist, formerly of the Tea Research Institute, now of University of Kelaniya, who will share with you some equally important aspects on tea. The health benefits in tea are what drives the tea category today. Tea began as a medicine, and today tea is having its rebirth as a medicine. From Dr. Tissa, you will hear the scientific basis for all the different aspects we share with you in relation to the healthfulness of tea. It is very important, because today every herb and every beverage claims different health benefits. You need to know the truth, because there is a lot of myth out there. You need to understand the truth of exactly what tea is, where its health benefits are derived from, and what is not tea. So you need to have those details. You will have that from Dr. Tissa. We then have the exam and go on with mixology and so on. Now I want to remind you that in the afternoon, between 2 and 3, you have an hour to prepare for the Train the Trainer program. And I also want to remind you that yesterday's exam carried 25 points. Today, the first exam at the end of at the end of the Dr. Tissa's Tea and Health session will carry 16 points. And finally, the afternoon session will carry 50 points. As for progress, yesterday's exam, on the basis of an average of all the the results. The winner is T-Series. David is delighted because his red Welsh T-shirt last night was eaten up by the New Zealand All Blacks on the rugby pitch. So you have a victory now, finally, David. The prize, I remind you, is a 1-hour spa treatment, plus the champagne for the team. And those of you who will be leaving today will get priority in the spa treatment to make sure you benefit from all that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to pay attention as Edwin talks to us about terroir. Edwin.
What we're going to do today in this session actually brings together everything that we've done yesterday. The sensory evaluation of the teas. We will yesterday we also looked at teas from different regions and different areas and different seasons, right? We had the water series, and then we had the uva and the dimbula. We compared those. So today we're going to compare single estate teas. So until we get there, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about how the tea plant grows and about all the influences on the tea plant and tea leaf, and ultimately the tea that you drink. Terroir is the term that we borrow from the French because they use this term to describe their wines. When people ask, why does your wine taste like this? Why is it different from the same wine made in other parts of the world? And they say, oh, yeah, it's simply terroir. And everyone, oh, you know, okay. But those that bothered to find out realized that actually is no, they use that term because it actually describes the encompassing of lots of different things. The soil, the climate, the elevation, the growing conditions. And so, in essence, it's basically the interaction of these things, the geography, the geology, the climate, and not forgetting the human touch. So all these things give a certain wine, or in our case, a certain tea, its sense of place. If you look at products from all around the world, agricultural products from the New World, from the Old World, especially Europe, they've got the PDO, which is a kind of a stamp that for food products that guarantees to the consumer that yes, this cheese or this olive oil comes from this region, is made in a proper manner by the manufacturer, following the directions of a tradition of that region. So you know you're consuming a product that is not like sourced from elsewhere and then repackaged, and so it's real food, as in when we talk about real tea. So terroir has its place in that sense. The hand of man comes in, besides all the natural things like geography, geology, and climate. For example, when you think about even other industries like coffee, they grow avocado trees next to coffee plants to provide shade and to give the coffee plants to provide the ecological balance in the coffee plantation. Or man might, let's say, prune a tree. Imagine talking to olive oil producers. They say, well, why do you prune your olive tree? You know, it's a beautiful tree. It grows on its own. They tell me that they prune it for longevity, to help manage the tree so that they can easily harvest the olives, but also it helps the tree grow for a longer period. So humans as well have a hand to play in terms of terroir. Okay, so what makes a wine different? People talk about, oh yeah, I drink a Cabernet Sauvignon, but the one from France tastes of black currants. The one from Australia, the Yarra Valley, has got the chocolatey flavor, and the one from the Napa Valley has got all those jammy cassis characters. So it's all made from the same grape variety, and more or less the production method is similar as well. So when you look further, you look at the soil, you look at the rainfall, you look at the climate, you look at the number of hours of sunshine the grapevine gets, and then you start to see a picture. Then you say, maybe it's because of those differences that the same grape variety made into wine tastes different. Another example, Chardonnay, right? From different parts of Burgundy, different parts of California, and you can see from those sub-regions, they're not very far apart, only a few 100 kilometers apart, or 1 or 2 degrees latitude apart, and they taste so different. So what could be the reason? Probably the climate and soil. The other idea I want to introduce to you is diversity. This is a chart of the different kinds of cultivars of Mangifera, which is really mangoes. So if you can imagine, mangoes originated from Southeast Asia and India, Philippines, and they're now found in China, Australia, lots of parts of the world where the climate is tropical and subtropical. So the idea to show you this is that there is diversity, and it explains why you have so many different shapes and sizes and flavors of mangoes. So borrowing that idea for tea, tea too can taste very different because there are different cultivars of tea, different varieties, and tea interacts, the tea tree interacts with the altitude, rainfall, soil, and of course, a man does things by fertilizing the soil or pruning the tea bush, giving the tea plant shade, growing different types of tea in different places to bring out the best in the ultimate product. So that's tea terroir. In essence, the tea plant needs 5 to 7 hours of sunshine to produce nice leaves and buds. Tea, the higher you go in altitude, maybe you get less yield, less, when you harvest per plant, you get less, as in the lower areas. Yesterday we learned about the drying effects of the wind, right, from the flush. It makes the tea more intense, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the first thing is about the tea plant. There are different kinds of teas. You've got the Chinese variety, and it's a very small leaf, right? You can see on the extreme right. And then you've got the other extreme is the leaf or the tea that comes from India, from Assam, which is the bigger leaf. And of course, besides that, you've got other types of teas. So the first thing to note is sub-varieties occur naturally. And then you may have heard the term of hybrids. What are hybrids? Hybrids basically is what the human does, right? They intervene in cultivation, and then they get different types of strains of tea. But it will all become clear very soon. Okay, so have a look at this picture. What is the difference that you notice between the left picture and the right picture? Exactly, you've got uniformity on the right, and the other one you've got clumps of bushes, right? Clumps of bushes. So if you go up to the tea plantations and you see clumps of these bushes, they sort of like growing wild, right? And they're actually the original tea plant growing wild. And what man has done, man has said, okay, within these clumps, I found a tea plant that I like. It actually produces beautiful leaves. The tea made from it is very good. I want to reproduce that only that one. So they take cuttings and they replant it elsewhere. And then this whole plantation on the right will have those properties of that wild tea bush, right? So that's how man has taken something from the wild and say, okay, I want to reproduce a certain characteristic in mass. Okay. Okay, right. Next. The original tea plant it's a definition, it's called seedlings. They're called seedlings. So any original tea plant, they're called seedlings. They're what was there before, what the British planted, right, from China. So those are seedlings. And you see all those clumps of bushes, they grow differently. Some are bigger, some are fatter, some are weaker. Some produce more, some produce less, some have got more flavors. When you make into tea, some have fewer flavors. So what man has done is they said, okay, let's propagate the properties that we like. So they find one of those wild bushes. They say, wow, I really like this one. Let's select it from the mother plant. Maybe it's very resistant to pests, and we will take a cutting and we'll reproduce it. So as such, everything that is not from the mother that's produced, right? You take it from the mother and you produce, is called vegetative propagation. So as you can see, I just showed you a few examples. They've got different names for them. This is the conventional one, and then they've got 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 series, 5,000 series, Tea Research Institute 4, 5, 6. So each number, like in wine they call them clones, but I don't want to confuse you there. Only the sommeliers will understand. Each vegetative propagated plant has got different properties and is chosen for what it can do best, because some plants are resistant to drought. So obviously, those are the ones you would plant in places where there's not much water. Some plants can handle a lot of water, so you pick those that you want. Of course, some of these are picked because of certain characters. Some may be very productive. They can produce a lot of leaves and buds, so they're chosen for that. So the concept here is there's a difference between seedlings and vegetative propagated tea plants. Okay. So let's begin. The first thing that affects the tea plant in terroir is the altitude. For every 1,000 feet altitude that you go, the temperature drops 2 degrees centigrade. So obviously a high-grown tea will grow at a different rate as a lower-grown tea, right? And you have already discovered yesterday with the water series that the high-grown teas, the color is not as dark, it's lighter in color, right? There's a more subtle taste to it. The lower-grown teas are thicker, darker, richer in character. So one of the elements that affects that is altitude. Next is soil. Soil structure is different, and there are lots of different types of soil. We've just chosen these examples just to show you 4 different types of soils at different elevations. So at the highest elevation, 2,000 meters, the soil is very fine clay. As you go further down to maybe 600 meters, right at the most bottom, you can see it gets very sandy. And what does sandy soil mean? When you pour water into sand, what happens? It runs off, it flows off, it flows off. The amazing thing is nature has its own balance. The lowlands get, of course, a lot of water, right? Because all the water flows from highlands down to lowlands, gets a lot of rain, and naturally, nature has given those soils, sandy soils, the water flows off, so you don't get water logging in the roots that rots the roots. So naturally, in the lowlands, you get soil which is more sandy, and as you go further up, you get soil that's more clay, right? Because clay soils retain water. The sommeliers will appreciate this, right? Clay soils retain water. Besides that, soil is also a container of minerals and food for the plant, right? So here is a chart that shows you how soil and water interact and how it's suited to the tea plant. As you can see, extreme left is the lowland where you have more sand or quartz, lots of water. But lots of water also removes a lot of the food, all the minerals, right? Because it washes away all the minerals. So what man can do in the lowlands is they might fertilize a little bit of the soil to give more food to the plants. Okay. So if you look at the highlands, extreme right, the soils are quite fertile. And that fertility also results in lots of growth of the plant. Obviously, you feed a lot, the plant just grows more and more, it gives more and more leaves. So we call it lots of vigor, many leaves. But because the temperature in the highlands are cooler, the plant also grows a bit slower, although they produce a lot of leaves. So now you appreciate the difference between highland, lowland, the rich soils and the less rich soils. Next element in terroir is rainfall. Water is life. And in Sri Lanka, the central hills are a watershed, like a forest. And of course, on the two sides, you've got the east and the west, which you're already now aware of after tasting the dimbula and the uva. And rain, of course, the plant needs water to live. I already mentioned this, lowland gets lots of water. The highlands retain water because they may not get so much water, so the clay soils retain water. Okay, so just to show you, it's normally drier in the east and wetter in the west in Sri Lanka. However, of course, there are differences in climate or weather every year that changes the usual pattern of what we expect. Okay. Next is the monsoon. We are in the monsoon. As you have experienced yesterday, we had lots of rain and wind. And monsoon brings with it rain. Sometimes monsoon brings with it rain closer to the coast and further away from the inland. Here's a picture that I borrowed from the newspapers. And you can see the effect of monsoon is quite different in spring, summer, and in winter. You can see that in spring, summer, it brings rain to the inland area. And in winter, the rains go out to sea and maybe on the coastal area. And all these tropical and subtropical countries experience the monsoon. So how does the monsoon affect the terroir in Sri Lanka? There are, as we mentioned, 2 monsoon seasons, but and if you look at these maps over here, the darker color, the more blue it is, the more rainfall and the more water there is. So you can see between the first part of the year, or rather, sorry, in the first picture, May to October, you've got your southwest monsoon, right? It's very wet, but it brings rain to the mountain slopes. Then comes the next period here. Sorry, we talked about May, October. Then comes the next period, October to November. You can see there's no monsoon, but you get inter-monsoon squalls, which is also rain, a little bit of water, because you can see the small parts of blue. December to March, lots of rain all over. And you can see on this side, lots of rain here and lots of rain here, green. And then March to May, thunderstorms. After, it's the inter-monsoon season again, and the rains are in this area. So monsoons, just to know, bring a lot of rain. Now, how does rain, water, and wind affect the plant? When you have wind, as you found out yesterday with the flushes, it makes the plant go into survival mode. The stomata close, and the plant produces more polyphenols and more character. So the tea becomes really very intense. So it dries. And the wonderful thing about the wind is it balances off the wet season. When it gets too wet, the plant is like, oh, there's too much water. And then come these winds that dry it up. And then the plant says, oh, I'm happy again, I'm happy again. There's, just this is the right conditions. Okay. So, because of the monsoons and the intermonsoons, you have seasons. Because some seasons are wetter, some seasons are drier, some seasons are warmer, some seasons are cooler. And because of all these things, that's why we have seasonal teas. And that's all there is to it. It's very simple. Because of all these differences, we have seasonal teas. Changed growing conditions bring seasonal teas. So let's look at the big picture now. From January to December, rainfall. This is rainfall. You can see that rainfall is moderate, and it goes up April, May, and then by October, November, December, wow, there's so much rain. Let's look at temperature. It starts off moderate, and it gets really hot. April, May, June, July, and then it tapers off. Solar radiation. Solar radiation is the amount of sunlight. Plants need sunlight to produce, right? To produce food, to get the food from the roots and produce. So sunlight also gets very high in March, April, then it tapers off, then there are a few small peaks. What is very interesting is the wind. You can see the two graphs of wind. The wind is really very strong, January, February, March, then it tapers off, and then it gets really strong again, October, November, December. So, how do we read this? In the beginning of the year, there's a little rain, but the region is warming up, but the winds are very high. So what does the winds do? They dry everything up, and you get intense, strong, high-quality tea. April to June, there's rain, it's hot, it's sunny, there's less wind. Okay, you get good quality tea, right? November, December, the eastern side get lots of rain, right? Eastern side, right? This the blue line, eastern side, right? November, lots of rain, but it gets also lots of wind. So the wind helps to dry up all the wetness. So the tea plant says, wow, great, can produce good quality tea. In the mid-year, you can see it's windy in the north, high temperatures, and low rain, right? The north is, by this little green graph, it's quite windy, not super windy, but quite windy, high temperatures, right? Some rain and sunshine. So mid-year, good quality for the northern areas. And of course, at the beginning of the year, we already spoke about that. There's lots of wind, the stress, and low rain, great quality. Okay, this we tasted, uva. This is a graph of wind speed. So what do you notice about wind speed? When is it highest? June, July, and August. So as we said, wind stresses the plant and it produces really good tea. So June, July, August, leading into September is when we get the quality season. And if you want to speak like a tea expert, you don't even talk about uva. You say, oh, this is Eastern quality tea. And all the tea experts will say, wow, you really know about your Sri Lankan teas. Okay, conversely, if you If you go to Dimbula, you can see from January to March, dry, cool winds, crisp air, and sunny, with cold nights and dry weather. So the teas can be delicate, but can be also strong depending on which sub-regions in the valley. The western-facing gardens, tea gardens, will get a lot of rain, but you get cool, dry winds from December to April. December to April, cool, dry winds. You know the answer, right? It means you get quality tea, and it's called Western quality. Nuara Elia, right top, very high. It has qualities of high-grown tea. The leaves are small, slow-growing. You get teas that are sort of quite fragrant with a sort of golden orange color, and it enjoys the east and western quality because it's right in the middle, right at the top. Gets rain and wind from both sides. So really good all year round. So just to summarize, you got western quality tea in Dimbula, you got eastern quality tea in Uva, and Nuara Elia, you've got your middle, really good teas every time. Okay. One thing I forgot to mention, the name of the wind, especially in Uva, it's called Kachan, C-A-C-H-A-N, Kachan winds. It's called the drying winds, C-A-C-H-A-N. Okay, we'll leave that. We'll talk about man's influence on the tea plant. What does man do? Man has planted tea. So man can analyze all the conditions for the tea plant to grow well. And he says, well, I look at the soil. I think the tea plant grows best when there's carbon, when there's zinc, boron, and magnesium, which are micronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the macronutrients. And when the plant has all these things, including the right temperature and right drainage and shade, you will have wonderful tea. So, man can do other things. They can add like dolomite to raise the pH and change things, but we'll leave that. Okay, what man has done, which is quite important, is that man has been able to match and grow the right types of tea in the right areas. So remember earlier on we talked about soils, different altitudes, and different microclimates. So man has chosen that the Chinese variety with the small leaves actually grows very well in the highlands because it's cooler there. It grows slower, and we can pick the leaves and the buds every 5 to 7 days. Whereas in the lowlands, compared to lowlands, man has planted vegetative propagated and more or less big leaf tea, Assam, the Assam type, because it's very suited to sandy soils, and it can handle lots of rain, and it grows very fast, and we can pick every 3 to 5 days. That's all there is to it, planting the right tea type in the right environment. So, in essence, there are main 3 types of tea: the China Jat, the Assam Jat, and the Cambodia Jat, right? Just 3 types. And mainly in the highlands, it's the China one, and in the lowlands, it's the Assam one. Okay, that's all. The environment also has to be suited to the tea. I mean, we sit in this room and we're so comfortable because it's air-conditioned and it's suited to us enjoying tea and learning. So for the tea plant, it also needs a little bit of shade, right? Too much sunshine could get sunburnt, right? As you know, we talked about, we mentioned about the Japanese, where they experimented with shade for their sencha teas. They give a little bit of shade in the last few weeks, and the tea plant produces different things and becomes sweeter. In Sri Lanka, we talk about providing shade trees. In the highlands, because there's less heat and sunshine. We provide shade trees, but we provide shade trees that are planted further apart. When you go lowland, it's really hot. We plant the shade trees closer to each other, maybe double the amount of the high-grown shade trees. The high-grown shade trees are grown 40 foot. The next one is 40 foot away. In the lowlands, 20 feet away. So more shade trees for the tea plant. We also shape other things. We provide fertilizers, manures, when we find the soil hasn't got enough food for the tea plant. And we also decide on how we want to plant the tea plants. Should we plant them far apart or should we plant them close apart? It all depends on the fertility of the soil, the drainage, the water, and what type of tea plant, whether it's the Chinese jat or the Assam jat. Okay. And then, of course, when we harvest, normally it's 2 leaves and a bud, but Dilhan will tell you that sometimes they have to take 3 leaves. But the quality is when you harvest 2 leaves and a bud. And of course, everything is hand-picked, sorted. You can end up with more tea leaves when there's more rain. And of course, again, I don't need to mention this, dry, hot spells, of course, tea plant goes into stress, it produces better tea. So other quality factors includes pruning. Once in a while, you have pruned the tea plant, right, to keep it to the right shape. Because if you don't prune it, what happens to the tea plant? It's actually not a tea plant, it's called a tea tree. It will grow and grow and grow, and soon you can't reach the leaves. So that's the tea tree. So you have to prune it. But when you prune it, you also kind of rejuvenate it to make it reproduce again. Okay. This was what I found was really interesting, because when I looked at used to pruning, as in grapes or other plants, people just cut off everything. But I noticed in the tea estates, they prune it and they just leave a little section with some leaves on, and they call it lung pruning. Because if you prune the whole plant and you remove all the leaves and everything, the plant actually goes into shock. But you leave a little bit so that it can still feel that, you know, it's still going on. It doesn't sort of go into hibernation completely, and it can still produce food with the leaves through photosynthesis. Pruning also, besides rejuvenation, you can manage the tea plant because you want it at a certain height. It's called, I don't know if you visited, you've seen, they call it the plucking table. So it has to be at the right height for pluckers to pluck. Otherwise, it's too high. You can't pluck too low. You get a backache. So you prune it so you keep it at that stable height. So man does lots of things to bring about tea. Manufacturing. Man also does adjust manufacturing. It doesn't mean that if we say this year we're going to produce uva tea, we're going to do it the same all the time. No, we adjust accordingly. So speaking with one of the Dilma's expert consultants, Daya, he was sharing with me about manufacturing. He says, no, we wither depending on the kind of leaf that comes in. If the leaf has got a lot of moisture, then we wither more. And if the leaf has less moisture, we wither less. And this is where everything comes into play. Remember sensory evaluation when I talked about sensory evaluation being used for quality control? So when there are seasonal changes and you're trying to produce the same quality and consistency year after year, after the manufacturing process, you taste the tea, and you must be able to rate it and say, yes, this meets the standard of what we were producing last year and the previous years, and we can release this tea. So that's where sensory evaluation comes in for the manufacturer. So I want to show you this picture about a wine region. It could be Italy, it could be Spain, but I've chosen California because it's relatively new. In the sense that they've started to use classifications of regions and sub-regions. So they say, well, you could buy off the shelf a California wine, but if you want a wine with a little bit more, you could buy a wine from the Sonoma sub-region. as opposed to the Napa subregion. Sonoma wine's a bit different too because the climate there is cooler. But if you want to go further, you can say, well, no, I want a Sonoma wine, but I want a Sonoma wine from a certain smaller area, from the Alexander Valley or from the Dry Creek area. And then you can even drill in further. You can say, well, I want it from the Russian River, I want it from the Green Valley sub-region, and then you can even name the vineyard. So you're drilling all the way in because you find more subtleties of taste and you appreciate all this, right? Okay, so in the same way, I think with teas, we're getting to this, we've evolved to this stage where we, with the water series, we're talking about high-grown, mid-grown, and low-grown. And today, we're going to talk about single estates. So within the high-grown, which estate and which tea, and why does it taste different? We're going to go drill in, right? So let's look at the example of a German wine classification, similar to the California example I showed you. In the German wine classification, you can drink a wine from Germany. So on the bottle it says Germany. So you're drinking a wine which exhibits the macro terroir. Or you can say, well, I'm drinking a wine from Germany. It's from the Moselle region. So it's also the macro terroir, but you can now you can identify a region from which the wine comes from. And the Moselle wines have a certain characteristic. Or you can say, no, I want to go further. I want to drink a wine from the Saar district. Yeah, so you go further. Or no, I want to drink a wine from the village, right, locality. Or better still, I want to drink a wine not only from the village, from that actual 1 hectare or half hectare or 1 acre of vines. So you're going really into the site. And in the same way, I think with tea, we're getting there, because you could very well drink a Sri Lankan tea, which has those characteristics of Sri Lankan tea. Talk to anybody, even people who just drink tea, but who don't know very much about tea. They say, yeah, there's a difference. I know Sri Lankan tea tastes like this, Indian tea tastes like this, Chinese tea tastes, because Sri Lanka has its own characteristic for its tea. But you can take it one step further. You can say, well, no, I drink Sri Lankan tea, but I like high-grown tea, because I like those characters of the high-grown tea, right? I like the Ranwata type of tea. Or you can even go further. You can say, well, I want to drink the tea from Nuara Elia, from that actual district. Go further. I want to drink the high-grown tea from that vicinity, but from the Pedro estate. Wow, now we're talking about Pedro estate. And then even within the Pedro estate, you could say, oh, there's this patch here that's called Lover's Leap. And this is the tea, the finest tea from this estate. So I think we're moving in the direction of tea cruise, a Grand Cru for tea. You know, you could say Lover's Leap is a Grand Cru, just as Domaine Romani Conti is a Grand Cru, or Chateau Lafite, what have you. Okay, so to summarize, seasonal effects, cold, warm, hot summers, winters, affect how the tea grows and how the tea tastes. Sunlight, of course, influences growth. Rain and humidity affects the crop. But more rain, more water, it grows more, right? Altitude affects the way the tea tastes, right? When you go highlands, the tea tastes different from the lowlands, which is more deeper, darker colors and more solid flavors. How the tea plant faces north, south, east, west also affects how it grows, because sun rises in east, sets in the west. The monsoon season, of course. Now we know the monsoon season brings a lot of water. And of course, how man had managed the tea plant. So it's older or younger tea plant also matters, right? As it grows older, maybe it produces less. As young, it's very productive. you can tell by looking at the leaf too, what kind of a tea plant it is, whether it's vegetative propagated or whether it is the original seedling, the seedling that came from China. And then, of course, different seasons, and then manufacturing can also be used to bring out the best in tea, just like wine. So to summarize, terroir is about soil, rain, sunshine, geography, seasons, microclimate, and what man does to bring out the best in tea. I just wanted to show you this. I was just researching how the business structure of tea is in Sri Lanka. And you'll notice that 60% of producers of tea are smallholders. They hold small plots of land, and they produce 70% of the total tea yield in Sri Lanka. Whereas you've got 21 regional plantation companies. These are the big companies that own estates, and they cover 40% of the area. But the fact is, if we can take the example from wine, in Spain there are a couple of wine gurus that make wine in their own region, but they go out looking for smallholders in some way out place, unknown, that were producing grapes to make their own homemade wine. And they go there and they say, can I buy your grapes from you? Because the grapes are planted on these rocks and it looks different. And they make wine from there and they present it to the consumer, and the wine sommelier is like, wow, blown away. Wow, this is amazing. Where did you find this wine? You know? So in the same way, I think in Sri Lanka, there are all these opportunities to look at what all these smallholders are doing, or maybe the different terroirs that they're using to grow the tea, to find all these, maybe identify all these crews of tea. Okay, besides that, let's go on to our tea tasting. You will see in front of you a placemat where you've got soil, you've got the actual dry leaf, and then you've got your wet leaf, and we're going to bring you the teas. And we're going to compare the teas from 4 different estates. Pedro, which is ultra high grown, Somerset, which is high grown, and 1 hour away from Somerset, Craighead, which is just slightly lower, and then finally from Opata, which is low grown at 600 meters. And I would take this opportunity now to examine the soil. Just if you don't feel comfortable, pick up some soil in your hand and feel the texture of the soil. So notice, you can squeeze the soil in your hands, and you notice the Opata is almost like quite sandy. The Craighead is also a bit sandy. And as you go up to Pedro, the soil is so fine. It's so fine, it's almost like clay. Right? There's a difference. Already there's a difference in color. You don't even have to touch it. Who are the sommeliers in this room? Wine sommeliers. Any wine sommeliers around? No wine sommeliers with us? One over there? Well, then there should be no problem tasting the soil too, right? If you want to. But no, I won't make you taste the soil. But in wine, sometimes we go to the vineyards and we taste the soil. Yes. I think the older bushes would get. But let me check this detail, because we haven't done this tasting yet. The sommelier was asking, like in wine, maybe the old tea bush will produce a different tea to a young tea bush. So we might have a tasting like that to find out. I haven't researched that yet, but thank you for that. That's a really good question. So now looking at the soil, you notice there's a difference in the soil. Some soils are higher, the color is darker, right, as you go further up. And If you were to analyze these soils scientifically, you find that the lower you go, the soil has got fewer nutrients. Phil has got a question. Okay, Phil. What time is lunch?
Just for me, the low grown looks way more like clay than the high grown.
Yeah, it does. On the feeling of it. Yeah, but if you feel it, you see, you can identify the quartz in there. It's really hard. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It reminds you of, yeah. This looks like loam kind of soil, right? And what time is lunch? Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, so maybe I might ask Dilhan to talk, say a few words about soil and how it contributes to a tea's color, flavor, and also Dilhan will take you through the dry tea leaf as well. He'll talk about the texture and the quality grade.
This links back to what we were doing in the seasonal flush session yesterday, and a lot of the research that Edwin has done with the support of DIA and also with the involvement of the Tea Research Institute is quite original. So in Sri Lanka, we don't have the same extent of the background information or the database as you do in the wine industry. But here you can see Edwin set up several simple principles linking the granularity, the drainage level of the soil, the thickness, but also there are other beyond this. So for example, Opatha Estate, you see the richness, the darkness of the tea, linked also to the humidity and to the intensity of light which influence the tea plant and the metabolic processes within the plant and ultimately therefore the taste. So you have this intensity reflected. You can see, we talked yesterday about the link with the eye also. So you see here the darkness in terms of the tea. So you see a very black leaf, you see a dark leaf infusion, and you see the darkness in the liquor. In a similar way, you see the darkness reflected in bitter chocolate notes here. You see it on the nose, and what I would encourage you to do is to get the linkage very clear, to also nose the infusion as we discovered yesterday. Now when you nose the infusion, you will really see a lot of what Edwin has presented coming to life, because the colors are distinctly related also to aroma and finally to taste. So when you nose the lower infusion, you get heavy fig notes, you get a little malt coming through as you go a little bit higher up, and then finally you get grassy green, and also in terms of color in the Pedro Estate, you see a much more olive highlights, you see greens, then you see in Somerset more coppery, and then it gets darker and finally ends up with a much richer. So you can see the connection between the eye, nose and palate, but layered on here, the theory that Edwin set out here is on top of that you have also the factors of the intensity of light, the heat, the humidity, which contribute very dramatically to the intensity of flavor and the flavor notes that you're seeing here. So here on the other hand, you have cool, generally much milder conditions in the case of Pedro Estate, but also influential here is something that we are researching now, which is in relation to the temperature difference that is between the daytime temperature and the nighttime temperature. So you have a much greater difference here, whereas here on the low elevation areas, which is really pretty much close to where we are, you're getting much more stable temperatures day and night. You're having maybe between 28 to 32, 33 degrees, whereas here you can have sometimes 10 degrees variation. Sometimes you get frost up in Nuarelia, and then you get a dramatic change in the quality of the tea and of course the yield also.
Thank you, Dilhan. So shall we now taste the teas? We should taste the teas. You got your spoons? The shade trees, which I didn't mention, also when the leaf falls, right, it turns into, it degenerates and then it becomes food for the tea plant as well. It provides, and then it mixes with the soil. It could be called loam. right? When you got organic material and all that. So let's taste the tea. Pedro. I don't hear this. Now that you're all accomplished tasters, you can use page 55, 56 of your book as a guide to some vocabulary if you want. There's vocabulary about color, so you can describe the color, right? Pedro, for example, is sort of dark golden, sort of a bit of antique gold color with it, a bit of green on the edge. And then you taste it and note down the flavors. When I compare Pedro with Somerset, Pedro has got higher sort of fruit, citrus characteristics and some grassy characteristics compared to Somerset, which is more the sort of nutty maltiness is starting to come in, the difference.
When you're tasting these teas, try to feel the weight of the tea. Because that you can see the distinct differences. We talked yesterday about tasting the high elevation, that's the Ranwatta, which is equivalent to Pedro Estate here, and the Yatawatta. Taste the two extremes, and as Edwin guides you through them, feel the weight, and you know that stickiness, what we call the gut in the tea, as you, particularly as you go down the elevations, feel the difference in the citrus element, which is very easy to discern, the astringency as you go up, and you can basically establish some simple rules, and this links very, very strongly to how you use tea in food and beverage.
So remember what we talked about yesterday about, Dylan mentioned about body and weight, but yesterday we also talked about astringency and bitterness. Do you notice a difference between the high grown and the low grown? There's definitely more astringency as you go lower, but some of the higher grown teas have some bitterness as well. And there's that fineness in the high grown tea. The low grown Opata estate, intense, but it's got lots of flavor. There's that bitterness there, some polyphenols, you can feel it on your cheek, and amazing thing, the flavor lingers. It lingers for a while. For the Pedro, I noticed the flavors develop in the front of my tongue, in front of the mouth, and then it's quite floral. So I think you will come to your own conclusions already by vision, by sight. You can see the different and the origins, the soil and the tea leaves, the wet tea leaves. And then finally, when you taste it, it all becomes obvious. Okay, let's see on this side. So we're good here. I think you have an appreciation now of the tea brought to you at your table from the soil, besides bringing you the tea plant. Okay. Any last word?
So when you taste this and when you feel the weight and all the different elements that Edwin spoke to you about, the astringency, the citrus notes, the fruit notes, and so on, this is the basis of how you would design your food pairings, or how you would design what ingredients you use the tea with in terms of cooking. Also, the same principle, of course, you have the lightness. Once you understand the essence of what Edwin has shared with us today, then you can decipher the entire code for gastronomy and mixology. Edwin, would you like to add a little bit more to that in terms of the sensory assessment of the tea and then assessment of the ingredients that that the teas could be used with?
You
in terms of food, and I'm trying to explain that this would be the basic code for your decisions on tea gastronomy and tea mixology.
Mainly high-grown teas, I would see them as high-grown teas. I appreciate them for their subtlety and character. Low-grown teas, I think, are more robust. They can handle stronger foods, probably even meats. I would go with meats, whereas the high-grown teas, I would lean towards seafood and delicately spiced herbs or foods. However, one thing I didn't speak about yesterday is one more additional sort of theory or trick from matching. When you match wine with food, sometimes when you're serving a very subtle, expensive wine, you don't want to also have a very complex dish to go with it. You pick a very simple dish so that you can show off your wine, so it will not fight with your wine. And you can use this, this example too for tea. If you've got a very fine tea, single estate, or even single garden. Single garden means one garden within that estate. For example, like single vineyards. So for example, like in the Pedro estate, you could have Lover's Leap, which is even one small corner of what Pedro estate has. You can say, oh, well, this is such a subtle and fine tea. Let's just enjoy it with a simple macaroon or something like that, just so that we can show off the tea really well. Okay. Any final comments, questions about tea and terroir? No? Okay, so comes to the end. Don't worry, exam questions are not too complex. I think you picked up already the general thoughts about how terroir affects a tea's character. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.